Hello, listeners, and welcome to an exploration of a little piece of Canadiana. Some of you may already know, and the rest of you will soon learn, that the Tim Hortons Brier starts today and will run until next Sunday. The Brier is, of course, Canada's premier curling competition, and there are few things more Canadian than curling. Perhaps the only thing more Canadian than curling is Canadian literature. The only thing more Canadian than Canadian literature is Canadian satirical literature. And the only thing more Canadian than Canadian satirical literature is Canadian satirical literature about curling. So, in light of that fact, and through the power of popular demand, I have prepared for you all a dramatic reading of W.O. Mitchell's classic, The Black Bonspiel of Willie MacCrimmon. Over the next 9 days, I plan to read a chapter a day for your listening pleasure. For those of you who think watching curling is more than enough, please do not listen to these recordings. For those of you who wish to follow along, search this book out at your local public library. For those of you who do not want to expose young minds to Faustian deals with the devil, I suggest you put your children to bed, grab a soothing beverage, and settle in. Finally, for those of you who know your children are already corrupted beyond any hope of salvation, now is the time to gather your loved ones near and listen. The Black Bonspiel of Willie MacCrimmon by W.O. Mitchell, Chapter 1. The winter sport of curling, in which opposing players send granite stones over an ice surface towards a target circle in an attempt to place them nearest the center, might possibly have been born in prehistoric times, when cavemen heaved rocks at each other from opposing ends of glaciers. It's just remotely possible curling is a sport that produces strange stories. It is also possible that the Vikings may have brought curling with them in their longships when they invaded Scotland and left the game there for Scots to continue it on down the centuries. Certainly, as infantrymen, kilted Scottish Highlanders took part in the 1759 Battle of the Plains of Abraham, when General Wolfe won a knockout match against General Montcalm that September. Through the long and frigid months that followed, for some winter fun, the Scots on garrison duty under General Murray melted down cannonballs into the shape of the Ailsa Craig granite curling stones they had swung, slid, and released down natural ice sheets at home. As an aside, the Ailsa Craig is an island off the west coast of Scotland, where 90% of the world's curling rocks today are made from granite from that island. Also, the island is in this shaped like a giant curling rock, but that's by the way. Quebec City's Ursuline nuns, concerned about the dangers of frostbite to the nether parts of the gallant Highlanders, knitted woolen underwear shorts for them. They were warmly and gratefully received. To the French-Canadian nuns as well as to the Scots goes credit for introducing curling to this continent on the green ice of the frozen St. Lawrence. There are no documents to confirm or deny this story. On the other hand, the Canadian Encyclopedia tells us that curling, as we know it today, was codified in Scotland and exported from there in organized form. The entry goes on, certainly the origins and early evolution of the sport in Canada were due to the consistent, enthusiastic, and ubiquitous presence of the Scots. Thanks to these pioneering Scottish settlers, this supreme winter sport spread all the way across Canada. From the first club in Montreal, formed in 1807, it spread east to Halifax and west to Kingston. The march west continued until 1910. Winnipeg was the acknowledged curling center of Canada. Around that time, curling reached the foothills town of Shelby, Alberta. Shelby had grown from the first homesteader's sod hut spaded and assembled on the banks of the Spray River just east of the Rockies. As in Montreal a century before, Shelby matches were curled on river ice. but by the early 30s the Jock McNair rink building with 4 sheets was built. By then, too, Shelby had grown from a small settlement serving the farmers to the east and the ranchers to the west into a community of 5,000, many of them devout curlers. The most dedicated of all were Willie MacCrimmon and his rink, made up of 3 Charlie Browns, nicknamed Pipe Fitting, Malleable, and Crosscut. All had curled from an early age. Malleable and Pipe Fitting had started when they were 12, and with other Shelby young had fashioned curling stones from concrete-filled lard cans with baling wire handles. They devoted equal time to hockey and curling on the Spray River. Crosscut had started a little later, as was to be expected of someone growing up in British Columbia. Willie had tossed his first rock at the age of 10 in his Scottish childhood, coached by his father. The senior MacCrimmon was a cobbler, as Willie would become. An only child, Willie had been 18 when the MacCrimmons had migrated to the New World. His parents settled in Toronto, where his father opened up a shop. But urban life was not for Willie. He had even considered returning to Scotland and, more importantly, to his first love, Mary McMurray. His second year in the concrete jungle, he put on hold his return to the land of his birth and decided to explore the West with its cowboys and Indians. He said goodbye to his father and mother to become a non-paying passenger on the CPR Railroad. He had made a wise decision, for in the foothills he found again the bonny braes and banks and streams he'd loved and lost. He found work on fall threshing crews, graduated to hired man, then to roughnecking in the oil fields. His father was not prospering in Toronto. Evidently, city Canadians simply threw away their damaged shoes and bought new ones, and saddles and harness were not top items for many Torontonians. Willie persuaded his father to move west and set up shop in Shelby. Here, for the next 2 years, they were cobbling partners once more, until MacCrimmon Sr. reached retirement age and with Willie's mother Maggie returned to Scotland. He left the shop to Willie. Now Willie could bring over his beloved Mary and Mary. He built a house for them to share for the rest of their lives together. It was on the right side of the railway tracks that bisected Shelby, so that there was a right side and a wrong side to the town. North of the tracks was reserved for the elite: druggists, doctors, lawyers, accountants, dentists, store owners. South of the tracks were known as the Johnny Flats, where those on welfare struggled along with the simply employed. Indoor plumbing had not been intended for those residents, so that Rory Napoleon with the honey wagon rolled through on regular visits with his team hitched to the human sewage tank and pump. This had to be the only ambulatory mural in North America. It had woodland scenes on both sides of the rounded tank, painted there by Mame, Rory's wife, with jack pine and spruce spearing up to the white clouds against brilliant blue sky and yellow wheat sheaves stoked in the foreground. Initially, it had been as fine a work of art as the does, bucks, and fawns drinking round the walls of the Arlington Arms beer parlor, though the painters of that art had been afforded a more stable wall canvas. The honey wagon did slop and spill and dribble, so that very soon Mame's landscapes changed from romantic representational to impressionistic to ultimate abstract, then finally to surreal. At one time, Shelby had boasted 5 churches, or 6 if the Nazarene fundamentalists worshipping on the second floor of the Odd Fellows Hall were counted. The number had been reduced by 1 when the Presbyterian Church was taken over by the Methodists to live after church union in the form of the Grace United Church. Spired, white, and unpretentious, the Baptist Church would last forever, as would the grand Catholic Cathedral of St. Therese and the elegant St. James of the Anglicans. The loss of his Presbyterian Church had been a lasting shock for Willie MacCrimmon, who was now one of a handful of Shelby's continuing Presbyterians with nowhere to pray locally. Now curling was his only active religion. Shelby's streets and avenues remembered the past with names like Bisson, Lafayette, Lacombe, and Berespaw. Main Street ran through the heart of Shelby, a business artery lined on both sides with stores and offices till it hit the railway line. Here were the Bluebird Cafe, Steve Hazard's funeral parlor, Chez Sadie's Beauty Salon, the Arlington Arms Hotel, MacCrimmon's Shoe Repair and Harness, McConkey's Menswear, the Royal Bank, and at the very end the Shelby Chinook, winner of the Pulitzer Prize for defense of the freedom of the press, in the days that Ben Trotter published it until he willed it to his nephew, Matt Stanley. Shelbyites were proud of their weekly, almost as much as they were of the 6 grain elevators lining the railway tracks beyond. What other town with a population of 5,000 had 6 slope-shouldered sentinels? Count 'em. And don't forget the finest stockyards in the West. Forget Mame Harris's 2 cottages out on the edge of town, boarding all those nieces of hers that changed every 2 months. On Main Street, the year's first soft snowflakes had begun to feather down as the man in a dark fog coat stepped out of Steve Hazard, licensed embalmer and funeral director, to walk down the street towards Willie MacCrimmon Saddle Harness and Shoe Repair. An elderly building, brittle with age, its foundation crumbled at one corner, causing it to tilt alarmingly. Beside it stood a building with a fresh young face of shingled black tile, over which a crimson signature angled Chez Sadie's Snips and Gossip. Ironic was Wally's shop next to a beauty parlor, like an old man in the company of a sporting woman. The man with the humbug and Van Dyke was obviously a traveling man, not a resident, for he carried a tan case of the type salesmen use for their advertising literature and their samples. Under his other arm he held a paper-wrapped bundle. As he stopped before Willie MacCrimmon's, 2 bearded Simonites came down the street in their somber clothes, wearing black, pale-shaped winter hats. As an aside, Simonites are a sect of Christians in the West, or that were in the West, similar to Mennonites. Each of the Simonites was carrying a limp-necked and naked goose for sale. Just as they reached the man in front of Willie's, a long black tail dropped out from under the fellow's coat. As he stooped to retrieve it, a business card fluttered out of his pocket. Mr. O'Clutie, Wholesale Souls, Retail Cents. Business and home address, 1313 Sulphur Boulevard, SS, Hell. The Simonites had no need to read the card. Ever since the Reformation, their Anabaptist sodality had kept up fervent resistance to the devil, and to sin and worldliness. This fellow had not done a large volume of business in Amish, Dunkard, Mennonite, or Simonite souls. Even before Cloutey had retrieved his tail and tucked it back into his hip pocket, the Simonites had turned and taken off. They did not even bother to pick up the goose that one of them had dropped. Satan headed back for Steve Hazard's funeral parlor. Evidently he had forgotten some additional business to do there before he would take the paper bundle into Wally's. Wally's was not a routine call for him, like Drew's pool, billiards, and snooker parlor, for example, or the Royal Hotel beer parlor, Mame Harris's 2 brown cottages out by the CPR depot, the penny ante room at the back of the Bluebird Cafe, the Dominion Day trotting races, or the Government Liquor Board store, to name a few more. Wally was no great sinner. A dod here, a dod there, not enough to count. Flower of the line MacCrimmon, descendant of professors of Pibroch and pipers to the chiefs of Scotland. He might not have been all sweetness and light throughout his 69 years, but he had been continuing Presbyterian and light. As Cloutey entered Steve Hazard's to attend to souls before souls, the Reverend William Pringle came out of Chez Sadie's, where he had been gathering donations for the new United Church. He was stopped in front of Willie's as he was accosted by a woman. "Oh, Mr. Pringle, I was hoping I'd run into you." "What is it, Mrs. Brown?" he said, this time. "Before Lucy Tregellis, before Lucy, has she talked to you already?" "About what?" "I mean, Lucy is on the Home and School Association." "Yes." "But that doesn't mean she's the whole Home and School Association. There are other members of the Home and School Association. Just because she thinks she is the whole Home and School Association, that simply does not make her the whole Home and School Association, even though she acts as though she were the whole Home and School." As many run-on talkers do, Annie Brown had lost the thread of what she must tell. Oh yes, it is not simply a matter, a responsibility of school board teachers. These are our children as well. Don't you agree?" "I might," Pringle said, "if I knew what you were driving at." "Simply put, the corruption of our young." "You've overheard coarse language on the school grounds again?" "No, the classrooms." "Oh, and Lucy Tregellis is in favor of it?" No, but she certainly is not objective about it when Charlie Tregellis is principal conflict between you and Lucy of interest." "So Charlie Tregellis has been using coarse language in the classroom?" No. The children have been." "No! Who has?" William Shakespeare, for one, and someone named Chaucer. Though he's not quite so bad, because it's a sort of dialect which makes it harder to understand." "Those are works of classical literature." "So you have talked with Lucy Tregellis?" "No, but I have read William Shakespeare and Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. These writers are simply filthy." "Earthy. A little bawdy now and again. Yes. Filthy? No." "Yes. The Home and School think they should be removed from the classroom. Uh, most of the Home and School do." "And what would the Home and School suggest in their place?" "Nellie McClung. Her Sowing Seeds in Danny is a beautiful book, and of course Uncle Tom's Cabin." "Uncle Tom's Cabin is obscene." "Black Beauty." "Oh, come on, Mrs. Brown. Black Beauty is the most self-centered, self-pitying whiner. Very few horses read her anymore." That's another thing." "What is?" "Harness racing. It's taken over the whole town, you know. The male portion. They gamble, you know. Fast horses, loose women." "I certainly disapprove of gambling, especially on loose women." As he said this, Mr. Clutie came out of Steve Hazard's and walked toward them. "'Day, Miss Brown, Mr. Pringle." He tipped his humbug to them and went on his way. Annie Brown stared after him. "Who's that?" "Stranger to me," Pringle said. "He addressed you by name, and me. I don't know him either. Very well dressed. Must be a travelling man. Probably from Calgary. So, Mr. Pringle, we can count on your support, getting Shakespeare and Chaucer out of our schools?" "No, you can't, Mrs. Brown." "And Dr. Fitzgerald's car." He turned to leave her again, but she pulled him back. "Buick sedan, license number FUA 4116, with the M after the doctors always have on there." "I believe I do." He was still trying to disengage himself, but she was hanging on. "Last 2 nights it's been parked in front of Mame Harris's. The last 2 nights—" "Mrs. Brown." "That I know of." "Mrs. Brown, being a minister, I can't afford a car. But if I could, you would have known its make and license number, and you would have spotted it there too. The last 5 days. Dr. Fitzgerald and I, one of Mame Harris's nieces, is quite ill. Ruptured appendix. It's been touch and go." He finally freed himself from her and strode off down the street. Nieces. No woman boards 7 nieces. New batches of them every 3 months," she called after him. "Touch and go, I'll bet." So that concludes Chapter 1. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. One thing maybe worth mentioning is the use of sibilants in the first chapter. Sibilants, just the close repetition of the S sound. And while it might have probably been a little bit annoying to listen to over recording, I think Mitchell's having some fun with it. The S is pretty closely linked to Satan, through the slithering of snakes and that kind of thing. But at the same time, the S sound sort of evokes images of sliding and gliding across ice, just like Wally's beloved curling rocks. Anyway, food for thought. Tune in tomorrow for Chapter 2, when we'll find Satan asking Willie to fix up some curling shoes for him. Until next time.